Title: Not This Time. The slap cut through the cabin like a thunderclap. 237 passengers on Flight 1742 froze. The noise of conversation, rustling snack wrappers, the hum of the engines, it all vanished in an instant. The only sound that remained was the ringing silence following the crack of flesh against flesh. 16-year-old Elijah Freeman's head whipped sideways. A red bloom spread across his cheek. His eyes widened in disbelief, not from pain, but humiliation. Across from him, towering with fury, Warren Trask jabbed a trembling finger into the air, his voice acidic and trembling. "I told you to stay in your place, boy." The words lingered in the cabin air like poison gas, suffocating, invisible, deadly. Phones were already rising. Passengers were recording. Flight attendants began moving briskly up the aisles, their faces tight, but still too far to intervene. For 3 long seconds, no one said a word. Not a whisper. Not a cough. Then, from 7 rows back, a man rose. Nothing about him screamed attention. He was mid-60s, average height, silver-streaked hair, deep creases in his face. Just another old man. One of those people you'd walk by 100 times and never notice. But there was something in the way he moved. Something in his posture. A quiet authority that made people turn their heads. "Sir, please take your seat," a flight attendant called. He didn't sit. "I can't do that," he replied calmly, with an accent just thick enough to hint at roots far from the American South. Not this time. In the 17 minutes that followed, every soul aboard that flight would be changed. The confrontation that began in seat 16B would unravel decades of silence, challenge generations of prejudice, and reveal a truth buried beneath 40 years of guilt. To understand why this quiet old man, Alexei Novak, a retired carpenter and Vietnam veteran with terminal cancer, stood up to defend a boy he'd never met, we have to go back 6 hours earlier, to Gate C-42 at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. 16-year-old Elijah Freeman hated flying. He'd only done it twice before, once as a toddler, once last year for his grandmother's funeral. But today was different. He was flying solo to Los Angeles for the National Science Decathlon, an academic competition that could change his future. "You got your boarding pass?" His father, Dr. Isaac Freeman, asked for the 3rd time in 15 minutes. "Yes, Dad," Elijah said with patient exasperation. "It's in the wallet." Same as last time. Dr. Freeman, a world-renowned cardiac surgeon, was a man of precision. His anxiety manifested in checklists. Especially today. Elijah was his only child. His legacy. "You backed up your presentation? Laptop, USB, cloud." Elijah grinned. "And emailed to you and my advisor." His father placed both hands on his shoulders. At 6 feet 1 inch, Elijah had already matched him in height, though he was leaner. Younger. Full of promise. "I'm proud of you," his father said. "Not just for making it to the finals, but for how you've handled everything." Everything. The word did a lot of work. It stood for his mother's quiet departure 11 months ago, for Paris, and a sabbatical that turned into a silence they were still learning to live with. "Thanks, Dad. But I gotta go. They're boarding." He hugged his father quickly, shouldered his backpack, and walked away with that strange blend of anxiety, pride, and the unspoken pressure of being not just a smart teenager, but a black smart teenager. The kind the world still watched more closely than others. Elijah had almost made it onto the plane when he bumped into a well-dressed white man in his 50s. "Careful there, young man," the man said with a clipped tone. The emphasis on young man didn't feel polite. It felt like a leash. Elijah straightened up and replied in his most precise, Ivy League-ready voice. "My apologies, sir. Just momentarily distracted." The man blinked, clearly not expecting that. He gave a curt nod and turned away. That look, Elijah thought. The one people give you when your vocabulary or composure doesn't match their assumptions. A few minutes later, he found his seat, 16B. Middle seat. Nightmare fuel. On his left, that same man in the gray suit, now absorbed in a tablet. On his right, by the window, a girl his age, nose deep in a book. "Excuse me," Elijah said. The man sighed as if Elijah had asked to rearrange the moon and stood, just barely enough to let him pass. "I had hoped you'd be in another section," he muttered. Elijah ignored him. As he sat, the girl turned slightly and whispered with a grin. "They really should make these seats for actual humans." She stuck out a hand. "I'm Zoe." "Elijah." She held up Dune. Good book. Classic. You started. Yeah. My dad said it was his favorite growing up. Thought I'd read it before seeing the movie. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by a loud throat clear from their neighbor. Some of us are trying to work, the man said sharply. Zoe exaggeratedly mimed zipping her lips. Elijah stifled a laugh. They passed notes, jokes, smiles. A brief reprieve from the anxiety of takeoff and the suffocating presence of Mr. Gray's suit. But the tension never really left. Every time Elijah's arm brushed the shared armrest, the man would subtly expand into his space. Then came the drink service. Then the arguments about disruption and quietude. Then the lecture about merit and diversity quotas. Then, of course, the slap. When Warren Trask struck Elijah, the world seemed to halt. And then, Alexei Novak stood. I saw everything, he said calmly, stepping into the row between them. You don't understand, Trask began. I understand very well, Mr. Trask, Alexei said. You think your age, your race, your status entitle you to dominate others. I've seen that before. In another country. In another life. Men like you. From behind, Michael, the quiet man 7 rows back, spoke with authority earned over a lifetime. You will not touch this young man again. The cabin was still as Alexei continued. When I was a young soldier, I made a choice to stay silent when a man like you struck a fellow soldier who didn't look like him. I carried that shame for 45 years. Not this time. The words broke whatever spell held the plane. The flight crew intervened. Police boarded the plane. Witnesses came forward. And Elijah sat in his seat, stunned not just by what had happened, but by the man who had stood up, not just for him, but for something larger. At the terminal, Elijah gave his statement to the airport police. His cheeks stung, but it was the weight of the moment that pressed harder on him. You have 24 hours to decide if you want to press charges, the officer said. He sat beside Alexei and Zoe in a row of plastic chairs. Are you okay? Zoe asked. I will be, Elijah replied. Then he turned to Alexei. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Alexei said. They talked. Slowly, gently. And Alexei revealed a photograph. 2 young soldiers, one white, one black, smiling in a muddy jungle. That's James Henderson, he said. He saved my life. 45 years ago. I failed him once. I won't fail his grandson. Elijah stared. James Henderson, my friend, Alexei said. And your grandfather. The story of Flight 1742 would go viral within hours. But for Elijah and Alexei, it became something deeper, the beginning of redemption, a passing of truth from one generation to the next. In the days that followed, Elijah would go on to win the National Science Decathlon. He'd receive a scholarship to MIT. But none of that compared to the quiet dinner he'd share with Alexei Novak, listening to the story of his grandfather and learning what real courage looks like, not on battlefields, but in aisles of airplanes, when no one else dares to rise. Because sometimes, one man standing is enough to remind the world what justice looks like. And sometimes, the second slap is the one that undoes the first. Not with violence, but with truth.